The chapter is entitled, Do We Have Early Testimony About Jesus? And the main idea is that the New Testament documents are early, abundant, and accurate, and contain even earlier source material that proves the authenticity and reliability. So, to be authentic means that it was written by the people it claims to be written at the time that it claims to be written. And then the so that's authenticity. Reliability is it true? It might be authentic, but not true. But it is reliable. And then some of the terms we'll talk about is non-Christian sources, manuscripts, reconstruction, historically reliable. And as you can see where we are in our logical argument, the New Testament is historically reliable. This is evidenced by early testimony. This is our first part of that. So early testimony. Now turn in your little atheist book to page 64. So what, if any, value, I'm on the emboldened, what, if any, value does a proper understanding of history have on a person's view of the New Testament? It's emboldened. I didn't ask you to do that, but I did ask you to do the reading. So we're going to talk about these two. But it's Monday, and even worse, Monday morning. So I'll answer this. Do you understand this idea of revisionist history? Yeah, it's basically revising history from our vantage point. And uh, and the people who best know ancient history would be those who lived through it, right? And so those source materials are very important. We need to be critical with them to make sure that they're saying what was happening. But those eyewitnesses are key, and knowing what um, um, the Bible or any ancient writing, if it's true. What most people believe about the New Testament is that it was written down, and the book says this, right? It was written down, not written down, it was passed down orally for however long, and so it can't be reliable. That's true. That's not true. I'm sorry. The Old Testament was passed down orally. Now, I don't think that's a problem because in those days there was very little writing in those days, and they had a huge facility for memorizing. In Jesus' day, most adult males had the entire what we call the Old Testament memorized. So I don't think that's a problem with the Old Testament. The New Testament was written down from the beginning. It wasn't passed down, and it was written comparatively very early. So, so it's we can be sure that the Bible that we have is what the people wrote, and we can know that what they wrote was true. Okay, let's do the equip, which is what I asked you to do. Who was Flavius Josephus? Let's start with that. Yes. Yes, he was the greatest Jewish sorry, historian of his day. He was He was a Jew. He was born a Jew, and he ended up being more Roman than Jew, and he was called a Roman historian. I think you read the story how Josephus came to Rome. He when the Roman um, army came down on Jerusalem and destroyed it, he gave him, other than suicide, um, rather than suicide, he asked if he could go with this general, and he ended up being the greatest historian in the Roman Empire. And so he wrote about Jesus. So um, I just told you who he is, um, and, uh, and so why he's considered an important figure in Christian history. So what did you write down for that?
He wrote about like Jesus.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, but right, we'll talk about that in just a second. But uh, why was he important? What made him important? Josephus.
Oh,
What? Why was he important? Why was he considered an important?
um, in his in his antiquities,
Yeah, he wrote about Jesus, but he didn't just write about Jesus. He was, as I said, considered the greatest Jewish historian of his day, and he lived shortly after Jesus, not many years after Jesus. Um, and his careful study and reporting of history, the history of the Jews of that day, lives up to with scripture. I mean, it corroborates what he said about Jesus and his disciples. It's what the Bible said. Um, but he didn't use the Bible uh, to, to know that. Okay, number two, how many non-Christian sources are there that mention Jesus? Yes. 10 non-Christians. So these are not believers that are talking about Jesus, but they're giving the same basic storyline as the New Testament. And if you add Christian attestation, uh, Christian writings, it's 43. Now, that seems like not very many sources, but in ancient terms, that's phenomenal that Jesus had. Jesus, the attestation of Jesus is better than any other ancient figure. Uh, and so, if we're not going to believe what is written about Christ, then we can't believe anything written by any of the Caesars or any other ancient figure. So, what facts would be revealed if you took all the non-Christian sources, pieced them together with the gospel accounts? And that's on page 223. And what are some of the things it tells us on 223 that we learn? Absolutely. Jesus was a wonder worker. What else? Yes. Christianity made all the way to Rome. else? Yeah. He was crucified by Pilate. I think one of the most important ones is that he lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. So that gives us a date stamp of when he lived. Go ahead. No. No, that was it. What else? Yeah.
Darkness and an earthquake happened.
Yeah. Now, some of these, let me try to find. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. So Josephus isn't saying he is the Messiah, but he's certainly saying that the disciples thought he was the Messiah. And then another one is that his disciples were willing to die for that belief. That one is very important, uh, in part because here's how I put it: nobody dies for a lie that they know is a lie. And if Jesus was lying, he knew it. And uh, but they all went to their deaths professing Christ as the Christ. And all they had to do was say, "We made it up," and they could have gone out of being murdered. They all went to their deaths. Now, John was the only one that had a natural death, but he was horribly mistreated. At one point, he was boiled in oil, so he went through all, and he didn't have to do that. All he had to do was say, "We made it up," and nobody did. Least of the disciples. Okay, so why is the game of telephone a bad illustration to explain the transmission of the New Testament? You all know this game, right? Where somebody says something into somebody's ear and they pass it on and pass it on and pass it on. And at the end, uh, what is what is said is completely different than what was written at the first. So why isn't the New Testament a game of telephone?
Because
Yeah, the account was is too closely similar. Yeah, uh, it wasn't passed down from person to person. That was true of the Old Testament, but in their day, it was an oral culture, and it wasn't a written culture, and they had tremendous facility of remembering things. But the New Testament was written down from the beginning, so it wasn't passed down person to person. So individuals wrote. Yes. You what? Okay. Are you leaving? Yeah. Yeah, you're leaving now. Yeah. Okay. So they wrote down their recollections because they knew it was that important, um, and they wanted posterity to know that eyewitness testimony. Oh, I know what I was saying before, though. So in uh, Old Testament times, most um, adult males had the entire Old Testament committed to memory. Uh, they memorized the whole thing. Um, but it wasn't, it was an oral culture, not a written culture. But we can be sure of the Old Testament too. That's just not what we're talking about today. So why isn't it a problem that we don't have the original documents? We only have copies. We don't have the originals. So why, of the New Testament, why isn't that a problem?
does every significant literature from ancient times is reconstructed into the original form by comparing manuscripts?
Right. And we have many independent pure copies. So a single copy could have been easily corrupted or lost, but we have thousands of both fragments and full New Testaments from ancient times, copies. And we'll talk about how they made those copies. But you need to know that they took it. That was the work of the scribes, and they took their craft very seriously. That they were writing it down, and we'll talk about that more. Um, so, how do we know? How do you know we have accurate copies of the New Testament? And the first thing says more manuscripts. So what can we do with all those manuscripts? Yeah.
And cross-reference the manuscripts to see what matches up. Like if you're looking for sources for a paper or something, you want to make sure that this site has the same information as
And the group was called the scribes, and they were in charge of making sure the copies were true, and so they would go through um, go through all of those copies to make sure they had um, the exact wording. And the New Testament has in the actually the number in your book is low because they're still finding copies of now. We're not talking about copies of the whole New Testament. There are some of those, but there are far more fragments that are parts of something. In fact, what was the name of the place? I can't remember, but people said that place never, Gehenna, I think it was, never existed. And then they found a copy that talked about it. And it was exactly what the Bible said. I don't remember if that was Old Testament or New Testament, but yeah, we have far more copies. I believe it's more like 15,000 of the New Testament now. I think they had 5,000 something. This kind of dated uh, information. And that's far more than any other ancient writing. The Iliad is the second, and there's only 643, maybe more now. I don't know, but not much more. That's quite a gap, isn't it? Then that speaks to how important the New Testament was to the early church. And then we have earlier manuscripts. So, so what do you know about the earlier manuscripts?
after we read it.
Yeah, quite soon after. Now, there is a gap, about a 15, 20-year gap. And people say, well, why didn't they write it down all right away? Well, they thought Jesus was coming back really soon. They didn't see the need. And then after about 10, 15 years, they realized, oh, wait, maybe we need to write this down. But that's really early. That gap is really, really early. And any rabbi, his followers were to memorize his teaching. So they had Jesus' teaching memorized. So we have fragments from AD 50 to AD 138. We have whole books from AD 200. We have the whole New Testament from 325. But the closest gap for any other writing outside the Bible is 1,000 years. So we can see how the earliest followers revered these words of Jesus and believed it was scripture. And then we have more abundantly supported manuscripts. So reported, or excuse me, supported just means who else is talking about this other than the disciples. So the Bible was quoted so abundantly by church fathers and others in writing that their writings contain all but 11 verses of the New Testament. So we have early church fathers also copying the New Testament, and we can reconstruct the New Testament almost completely from their writings. We're going to watch a video about this at some point that'll help you understand it too. So we kind of already touched on this. How is the original New Testament reconstructed? So today it's called textual criticism, and textual critics look at all of the copies, and then what do they do from that? Right. So they look at all these different copies. And this is the same, and this is the same, and this is the same, and this is the same. Why is that one different? So which one are you going to go with? The one that's different, or the many thousands that are saying the same thing? Does that make sense? So you can be certain, or as possible, that the Bible that you hold in your hands is the same Bible that was written long ago. So we're going to stop there. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. So I'll write that up there now. Your first quiz is tomorrow, and then a week from tomorrow is your letter. And I'm not giving you any homework, so if you want to chat, you can. If you want to work